Welcome to the Good and Basic podcast, a long-form conversation between Joseph and Joseph of the Good and Basic YouTube channel in which we discuss philosophy and all other sorts of topics. Today, we have a special challenge. It's kind of a treat. Today, we're going to see if we can define the word woke in less than 30 minutes. Okay, Joseph, go. What does
My
woke
first
mean?
reaction. Oh, sure. So my first reaction to the question is no, we probably can't. But boy, are we going to try. My second reaction to the question is yes, we probably can, but I think there's probably a lot of definitions for it, and that might seem kind of obvious, but I really do think there is. I think it's used by a lot of different people to mean a lot of different things, and that in many cases it's not obvious what they mean. And then my third reaction, as I've kind of ruminated on this question, is I think that maybe the best way to understand it is to think about it kind of along the lines of, framing it in terms of the matrix, right? If you're woke, it means that you've woken up from the system that is chaining your mind. You're aware, you're enlightened in some sense, right? It's like coming out of the cave in Plato's allegory of the cave. Right? You're especially conscious. It's sort of esoteric knowledge, maybe. And that raises its own sort of interesting set of implications. But I think that's probably it's not even a definition, really. It's sort of like a conceptual cloud. But that sort of meaning, I guess, is probably where I think I'm going to land, at least preliminarily. Do you want to take a shot at the same question?
So I think highlighting the way that it's used by different groups of people is incredibly important. So historically, as I understand it, the term starts getting bandied about in about 2014 as a word for awake. You are woked up. You have woken up, like you were saying to the Matrix. Particularly around racial injustice in America. That's what it was kind of aimed at, being aware of how the system's rigged against you. The way it's used right now most often is as a sort of boogeyman, as a marker, as kind of a loose descriptor. You know how the word hipster can't really be defined? It's kind of like that. If you're woke, it's a difficult thing to define, but you can kind of sort of point at a bunch of cultural trends and say that they are woke. And what that means is far left, progressive in kind of an unhealthy way, obsessed with race in a way that's unhealthy and toxic, perhaps, and obsessed with things like gender and sexuality, particularly when it gets attached to media. There's a very popular saying on the internet right now, go woke, go broke. And right now, we're in the middle of the boycotts against Budweiser beer because of their connections with a TikTok influencer who is, as the critics will say, a man wearing woman face. So that is woke. It's a cultural movement that is a little bit too obsessed with things that are surface deep, which is really funny because that is the opposite of being awake to the Matrix in some ways.
Sure. So I'm just going to react to what you said, I guess, because it's such a large cloud of, at least to me, it's such a large and sort of mysterious cloud of ideas that I think probably I'm just going to react and kind of see where it goes. But so it does seem to me that, like, as far as the substantive content of whatever wokeism or wokeness is, it does seem to center probably on issues of race and sexuality, at least mostly. I'm trying to think of an exception to that. It might be class. Class might be another one in there, but it doesn't fit as neatly in there. I think people who are woke don't necessarily, or who would self-consider themselves woke, probably don't. I don't know if they consider class to be part of that constellation of woke ideas. And I think those who use woke as a pejorative, I'm not sure that they really see class as part of the woke constellation of ideas. So I think as far as substantive content, maybe class, but probably mostly race and sexuality, issues surrounding those. I kind of aimed my definition not at the substantive content of the ideas, but at the style of the ideas, sort of the form of the ideas, right? I'm not saying that one approach is necessarily better or worse than the other, at least not yet. But I think of, for example, how, at least as I understand it, Marxism predicted a revolution of the proletariat that was supposed to begin in developed countries and then really did not begin in developed countries. All the countries that adopted a communist political and economic system were all relatively undeveloped countries. You know, communism did not really take hold in France. It really did not take hold in Germany or the UK. It took hold in Russia, right, which was comparatively underdeveloped at the beginning of the 20th century. And over the 20th century, Marxist theorists struggled to account for why that was, why the developed capitalist nations were not turning to communism. And the theory that they came up with, at least as I understand it, is what they called false consciousness. And it's essentially the idea that the poor capitalists don't know how oppressed they are. They live under a false consciousness of of the realities of how they're oppressed in the economic system that they're under. And it seems to me that woke, in terms of the wokeism or wokeness or whatever it is, right, in terms of the format and structure of its ideas, always points towards that sort of matrix allegory of the cave, false consciousness type of thing, where it says everybody around me who differs from me on these substantive issues is sort of either consciously in terms of being an oppressor or unconsciously in terms of being deceived. They're part of this. They're part of this false consciousness. They don't see the world right. They're not awake. They're not seeing clearly. They're living, as it were, in a dream. They're not seeing reality properly. So to me, it's kind of the stylistic and formal characteristics of wokeism that really draw my attention and that I think are distinctive.
Those are incredibly significant. You brought out the Marxist connection, and I actually think that Marxist connection is more than skin deep. There's a number of the founders of the Black Lives Matter organization, and that's another funny one. So there's Black Lives Matter, the statement. That is a premise. Do the lives of Black people matter? The answer is obviously yes, obviously. But then you have an organization that wears that those three words as its name, and it has its own identity. And maybe it does good things in the world, maybe it does bad things in the world. But when you have a tautologically true thing right at the beginning of as your name, if someone disagrees with the organization, the question is, do you disagree with the organization or with that tautological statement right at the beginning? I mean, not strictly tautological in the sense that it's self-proving, but I mean, so obviously and axiomatically true. It's interesting. You basically set up the name as a shield that makes you uncriticizable. Anyway, a couple of these founders were, in their own words, trained Marxists who were looking to create a destabilizing revolution in America. And so I think that style of rhetoric that you are highlighting, that idea of saying, okay, we're losing, we're just going to claim that's because people are essentially stupid, that they are blind, that only I and I alone see the truth. I am part of an elect who gets it. That is an incredibly dangerous way to think. If you think that you are part of some secret knowledge, that is a massive red flag. And if your secret knowledge allows you uniquely to understand the world, it is likely a story that is a little bit too simple and a little bit too direct at explaining the world, and probably misses an awful lot of its complexity. For instance, if you think that all of society is economic, as the Marxists do, and that the workers, if they are supporting the capitalist system, are doing so because they've been duped and they're asleep, and they have false consciousness, that is not ascribing to them agency. And I find that to be insulting.
So let me, if you don't mind, I'm not sure if I'm well, no, in some ways I think I'm pushing back against what you say, but I guess, I mean, and to clarify, I don't think many people would think of me as highly woke or highly sympathetic to wokeism. I don't think I give off that impression. I don't think most people would think that. And I don't think I am, probably. That said, I do find myself drawn to and attracted by esoteric knowledge. I believe in esoteric knowledge. I believe that, how to put it, that knowledge is not only readily accessible in the way that, like, you can open a phone book and find a phone number. That kind of knowledge is in some sense readily accessible. But I believe that knowledge, and certainly the most important types of knowledge, are a product of, how to put it, they're not as easily accessible. They are in some ways arcane or esoteric. And maybe to go to that, opening a phone book and finding a phone number example, you have to know a few things about numbers and a few things about phones, and perhaps even be able to read in whatever language the phone book is written in, right? And so there is, right, perhaps knowledge of a language is in some sense esoteric, right? Knowledge of English is not super esoteric to me or you, but, or at least it doesn't seem that way, but, par contra, maybe that's just because we've acquired that esoteric knowledge, right? Certainly knowledge of languages that I don't know, like Finnish or Chinese, they feel extremely esoteric, right? Languages, that might not even use the phonetic alphabet, or that might use radically different grammatical structures, or that embody radically different ideas. I guess I should say communicate, well, maybe they embody radically different ideas. Like, those languages are esoteric. So, and I think that other branches of knowledge are like that too. And I think that, everybody, roughly speaking, experiences that whenever they speak with somebody about an area of knowledge in which they are very experienced and very knowledgeable, but in which the other person is not. You do have this sense of, you just don't understand, this sense of, like, I have been admitted to the higher mysteries, this sense of esotericism, right? And I think that, at least stylistically, wokeism does point towards that esotericism, but I don't find that to be necessarily so much the objectionable thing about wokeism, at least to me. I do agree with you. You raise this issue of agency where, for instance, with Marxist false consciousness, there's sort of this sense of, like, these poor, dumb, deluded middle-class capitalists, they'll just never understand their own interests, right? They just don't really understand what's going on, and they never will, because the wool has just been pulled over their eyes too much. And I do resent that for what I think are similar reasons to which you resent it, which is that it's patronizing and condescending, right? It's insulting and denies, like you said, denies them sort of capability and agency, right? It carries this implication of, like, you poor dear soul, you just can't really form your own opinions or think about things because your opinions and beliefs are just the product of your environment or something like that. It's like, well, first, that's so insulting that I don't even know how to respond. And second of all, that is, almost certainly not true, right? Like, people can be deluded, but that doesn't mean that they don't have their own opinions and that they can't stand up on the authority of their own two opinions and on the authority of their opinions and hold them as their own opinions. So I find that more objectionable, but I think that at least to me, the esotericism is much less of a red flag.
So
or
the
perhaps
esoteric,
a red flag for other reasons. Okay.
the esoteric thing, I think, is a red flag, but not all red flags are death nails. They're not a guarantee that it's wrong. It's just something that you should be wary of. There's an awful lot more societies, groups, and individuals claiming esoteric knowledge than actually have it. And one of the things that's really frustrating about the oppressor-oppressed narrative that is baked into Marxism and also baked into some of that first definition of what it means to be woke, to be awake to racial injustice and injustice of oppressors and oppressed in, sexuality and gender as well. The thing that's the most red flag, the thing that's the most concerning and that is a red flag more than anything else to me, is that it's an easy idea to grasp. It's a quick idea. It is a very low resolution image. It allows you to ignore an awful lot of inconvenient details, and it has extremely powerful explanatory value. You and I both studied English literature in college. And when you're studying English literature, an awful lot of what you do is you write critical analyses. That's where you break down a story and basically explain what it means. And when you do that, one of the things that you study are called lenses, critical lenses. where you can take a particular perspective or a particular idea and then look at the text through that idea as if you were looking through a lens that kind of colors it. And one of those lenses is Marxism, where you can kind of boil down the plot of a novel and say, this is what this novel is really about, is about the conflict of the workers and the owning class, and it's about, you know, class struggle fundamentally. Or you can look at it through queer theory, or you can look at it through new historicism, or a bunch of different lenses that let you highlight different aspects of the text. And it's really easy to write a Marxist, to look through that lens and write a critical analysis of a story, because it's a very easy lens to adopt. That having been said, if you adopt that lens, it works because it highlights certain things and ignores everything else. And if you look at a story through that lens, it ignores almost everything that makes the story worth reading. There are some stories that lend themselves really nicely to that, where that actually is a really good way to look at the story. A lot of Dickens novels kind of lend themselves toward that. But even then, it leaves out so much of what makes the story rich. Good literature and good stories very seldom have easy morals of the story. They're difficult to sum up, and they're difficult to sum up because they're complex, just a little bit less complex than life as we live it, but complex enough that we can learn something about life because it's similar to life. And life doesn't, generally speaking, have easy answers. I think there is secret knowledge, but I think you kind of have to bleed for it. Like you were saying, it requires an awful lot of effort to get it. And one of the things that's dangerous about something that claims to be this esoteric secret to understanding the world is that if it's easy to grasp, if you can get it in an afternoon, it probably ain't it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. I'm thinking now.
What do you think of the individuals? So there's that first definition of woke, where it means awake. You've escaped the matrix. You understand things as they really are. You understand that the systems of America, socially and politically, and maybe even legally, are designed to oppress people based on either sexuality or gender or race.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the people who say that the word woke actually means that, and it is incorrect to use it in its second definition of being a pejorative against, you know, cultural influences that are too obsessed with those markers? Do
Sure.
you think that
So,
there is a strict, correct definition, and that the other one is like you're using the word wrong?
well, hmm. I don't think so. I don't think so. But I'm interested to hear your perspective. Or do I go first? Either
You go
way.
first.
Okay, here's why I don't think so. Because one of the things that we use words for is to explore new ideas, right? And so it's very easy for me to imagine somebody sort of using, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding your question, but it's very easy for me to imagine somebody using the first sense of the question in this sort of general sense of like having escaped the matrix. If you're woke, it means that you're conscious to things that other people aren't, specifically probably issues surrounding race and sexuality. Um, and well, no, hang on, I'm backtracking a little bit. Well, let me put it this way. If you are a proponent of wokeism, I think you probably want to use both meanings of the word, right? You want to say, this is about race and sexuality. There are issues, important issues surrounding race and sexuality, and I'm right about them because I have escaped from the cave. I have escaped from the matrix. I am not, ensnared by the webs of false consciousness. I see. I am awake. And I think if you are anti-wokeism, then your response is, well, of course I value being awake and conscious and sort of like escaping deception, but like I disagree that your substantive beliefs constitute that. I think you're just in another cave. You're the one under a false consciousness. you're the one deluded by ideology, right? So does that answer your question, or does that not?
I think it gets close. The short answer for me is no. I don't think that there is a wrong way to use the word. I think when you're having a conversation about any of these contentious issues, especially any word that has become political, such as the word liberal, um, when asking someone if they are liberal, you need to be really, really clear about what that word means in this conversation. And that asking that question can be a really useful place to start building understanding and to have a real conversation rather than the usual talking past each other matches that we have when we discuss politics. We being used very generally. This is probably something that you've experienced, dear listener, where you just start throwing words at each other without any of them really sticking. The word liberal is currently used to represent left-wing ideas in American politics, and it is used to basically democratic coalition. But the word itself used to have roughly the same meaning as the modern word libertarian, although slightly less anarchist. The word libertarian was developed in the 50s because the word liberal, what it used to be, had shifted so much that they couldn't call themselves liberal without raising confusion. So, I mean, that word is ambiguous. And when any word is ambiguous, as is the case with almost all political words, like the word Republican, do you mean a member of the Republican Party, or do you mean someone who supports Republican ideals, as in a structure of government that is representative on every level of the level below it? I think it's really important to ask the definitions. So when
Sure.
you say woke, what do you mean? And then the person answers, and we say, okay, for the purposes of this conversation, we are going to say that that word means that. And I'm perfectly comfortable discussing woke in either of these two definitions that we've discussed. I just think it's important to clarify which one we're talking about before we start talking much
Sure.
further.
Well, and I think that certainly, and this is kind of implied, I think, by what I said earlier, but I'll say it more explicitly, that if you consider yourself woke, or if you consider yourself pro-wokeism, I mean, it's hard even to find the right terms, right? But something like that, you gain a lot of cachet and power and persuasiveness by tapping into the meaning of woke as having escaped the cave and being enlightened, right? Because, well, if you've escaped the cave and you're enlightened, then you're probably right, and everybody
Go,
disagrees,
your opponent
probably
is in
wrong.
the cave and is a blind dunce.
Bingo, bingo. There's another dynamic that plays out here that I think is really interesting, which is I'm going to attempt to draw an analogy between both these meanings of wokeism and sort of revolutionary movements. So if you're a politically revolutionary movement, you want to get rid of whatever structure, regime, or system of government you're under, roughly speaking, right? And that is sort of an easy position to take in some sense, because you can point out everything that's wrong with the existing structures of power and therefore say, well, we should get rid of them. Because you are a revolutionary, your work is probably, tends to be aimed primarily at tearing down existing structures. And that's just sort of an easier position to take. Now, if you succeed and tear down those existing structures, then those existing structures, either have to be replaced by something, or, perhaps by nothing, but probably by something, right? And so you must pivot sort of from a revolutionary position to a kind of new institutionalist position, or at least there's a strong drive to. There's a saying that I believe emerged from the French Revolution: the revolution eats its own children, right? That seems to attest, at least in part, to this way in which once a revolution succeeds and takes power, it itself becomes susceptible and vulnerable to the same revolutionary impulses that put it into power. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that kind of applying this to wokeism, to the extent that wokeism, is or purports to be sort of a revolutionary movement, and I think it probably does. I think that's pretty reasonable. There's this way in which at the beginning it doesn't necessarily feel compelled to define itself or to extend a complex intellectual infrastructure around itself. or a complex political infrastructure around itself, because it can sort of survive and thrive and persuade simply based on, look how bad the existing structure is, and wouldn't we love to stretch beyond that in some sense, and escape the matrix. The more power wokeism gains, the more influence it gains, the more it becomes embedded in systems of society, whether that's government or schools or just ideas that have purchase in the minds of lots of people. The more I think it sort of loses its right to claim that it is an escape from shackles. And the more I think it becomes vulnerable to the charge that, well, you're just giving us a different set of shackles. So don't come to me with this escaping the Plato's cave. You just want to bring me into another cave sort of charge. And and there could be potential answers to that, not least that, well, maybe the new cave is better than the old cave. Maybe the new shackles are better than the old shackles. But I do think that as wokeism progresses and becomes more influential, it sort of starts to have to bear its own weight and becomes vulnerable to attacks under that. It becomes vulnerable to attacks that exploit that fact, let's say. And I think we probably are seeing that. Obviously our discussion is not solely limited to the United States, but it's probably kind of centered there. I think we are kind of seeing that where certain things that happen in curriculum decisions at higher institutions of learning, specific government policies, start to have to kind of defend themselves. It moves from the realm of idealism to reality. And, ideals are hard to criticize because they're so ideal, but realities are very easy to criticize. So I think we are probably actually already seeing that dynamic begin or proceed.
I think fundamentally what the word woke is about, and I think a good way of understanding what's happening in American politics and politics globally is it's a religious war. It is a war for converts. We are having a battle primarily of ideas, and I hope it stays that way. It's best when battles over ideas stay verbal rather than physical. I don't want to see any fights break out of this any more than already have. And I find it very interesting. So when you're discussing Plato's cave, and the question is, are you escaping from one cave into another? Are you just blind in a different way? Have you just adopted a simplifying idea that has taken hold of you such that you aren't a person with an idea has you and you're possessed by it? You have to have an underlying belief, no matter what you believe, that there is an outside to the cave, that light is real. There's a notable argument made by atheists such as Stephen Fry, which is brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant little snippet where he says, you don't believe in most religions. He's arguing with someone who is arguing for one particular religion. He says, you don't believe most religions. You don't believe in the ancient pantheon of Rome or of India or of all these other places. And then he says, I just believe in one less religion than you, one less God than you do. And that idea kind of that idea that there is nothing up and down in belief, there is no superior belief, it's all relative, it's all lateral motion. If you change from one thing to another, you're not moving up or down to something better or worse, you're moving essentially side to side to something that's equally irrelevant, unless you can somehow get outside of it, as the atheists purport to do. I do believe that you can get better and worse. And when we're talking about esoteric knowledge, I do believe that there are answers to these questions, that there are right ways to consider that. I just believe that they're difficult. And what that means is I need to approach the questions that we're discussing in these, political quasi-religious wars of wokeness. I think you need to believe that there is a right answer and that it's hard to get, which means you need to be humble and persistent, You're persistent because there is a right answer out there somewhere, and you're humble because you need to believe that the answer that you're holding on to right now might not be it, or at least might not be it all the way. And I think that translates into the way that you treat people, where you listen honestly, you ask them what they mean by their terms. And when you poke holes in them, you're not poking holes in someone else's ideas to score points, to put them down, to other them, but to try to get to something that is better. And that's part of that persistence, because we need to have an underlying belief that there are right answers, that there are better and worse ways of conducting ourselves as a society and organizing our institutions and treating each other. So those are my 2 bits there. I do have one other thing that I'd love to throw out there. I think part of that humility, and this is vaguely related to that humility idea. If you declare yourself to be woke, you have instantly defined everyone who is not on your team. If you name your team woke, you've defined all of your enemies or opponents as not woke, asleep. And so you've claimed a high ground that you might not deserve. I think that style of naming, where you name your organization Black Lives Matter, where anyone who disagrees with you is kind of insinuated to believe that Black lives don't matter. I think that is a very toxic way to conduct yourself. I think it's very effective rhetorically, because you get to define your enemies in a false way that paints them in a negative light. There's a name for that. It's called straw manning. But I don't think that is a humble way to pursue these answers. There are answers. We should pursue them persistently. They're hard to get, so we should pursue them humbly.
Well, I certainly believe in answers that are hard to get. So that sounds good to me. I need to cut off, unfortunately, as you know. I would love to return to this subject. So I, for one, am exceedingly curious, dear listeners, what your comments are. Which elements of our definitions or explanations you found most or least persuasive, and why. If you want to, you can take the 30-second challenge to define wokeness. Would be very interested to hear what you think, as always, in the comment section.
With that, we thank you for listening. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and let us know if you want to see a "Can we define wokeism in an hour" podcast in the future.
Oh boy!
Till next time, this is Good and Basic. Have a great day.